Lola Loustaunau is an assistant professor at the School for Workers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve of San Francisco. As a researcher, teacher, and activist, Dr. Loustaunau has led multiple research projects focusing on job quality, public policy, and collective organizing, particularly focusing on women migrant workers. She relies on community-based participatory action methodologies and produce public interest research with different community and worker organizations. Her current research analyzes the experience of women migrant workers employed in the food processing industry, particularly looking at the health and well-being impacts of their work and their experiences of collective action.
Everyone, I'm Lola Loustaunau. I'm an assistant professor here at the School for Workers, which is, I found a not very well-known department. We're a department that focuses on labor education, so a lot of our work is community-facing. We work with unions and other community organizations, and most of our research is on labor conditions, job quality, collective organizing. That's the bulk of the work that we do. And today I'm going to be just sharing a little bit of my most recent and some of my current work, which focuses, as Perna was saying, on migrant women in the food processing sector. Yeah, so I'm gonna take a step like Uchida did because it's better, it's nicer actually. So I usually call the food processing plants kind of like the forgotten factories, right? Because in some ways, research on migrant women usually focuses either on farm workers, right, particularly in the United States, which is where my research is based, or maybe on domestic labor. But we forget that actually the food processing sector has historically and still presently really relied on women of color and migrant women to really carry out a pretty dangerous and fast-paced production process, right? And it is interesting that while the way in which, us as consumers, we consume more, pre-cut, clean, pre-packaged, even seasoned food, right? When we go to the grocery store, the production of like the number of products we find that require more and more previous processing has increased. The reality is that what I'm going to call the organized disregard for workers' well-being and safety that plagues the production process really continues to remain in the shadows. So part of what I do is try to like highlight the present working conditions, right? And it's very common for people to be surprised that some of the working conditions that we find right here, right here in Madison. I did a lot of my work in the Pacific Northwest. And people were really surprised in really progressive states to find type of working conditions that they usually think only happen in the global south, but they do happen within the United States, right? And the second part of my research really looks into trying to unpack some of the practices of collective resistance and collective care that a lot of the migrant women really develop in order to try to transform their working conditions and improve their lives and their communities as they do that. Sorry, I'm so bad at, there we go. Okay, so most of the research that I do is really community engaged, so really qualitative based with the workers and for the workers. And I always like to bring in, their own words when I'm trying to present what's going on. So that's why you're going to see a couple quotes from workers, and I'm going to provide a lot of context, I promise. But I do think that workers themselves are the best, in describing their conditions and their situation. And here what you see is a quote from Angie. Angie is, and I'm going to be using pseudonyms, of course. Angie is a fruit packing worker, has been a fruit packing worker for many years. And she actually unexpectedly became a leader and an organizer during the COVID-19 pandemic and led not only her, the company in which she worked, but 6 other companies into a 1-month-long strike to try to improve their working conditions and improve the safety in their workplace, right? So I think that in some ways, what happened during the pandemic is that maybe perhaps like even just for a brief moment, conditions in these plants were visibilized because there were a lot of outbreaks happening, right? But that also made the narrative around the conditions in these factories to become like an exception, right? And part of my research seeks to interrupt that exceptionalizing narrative and really show that what we find in these factories is an endemic precarity, right? Something that has been going on for a very long time and continues today, right? So I think that, you know, in some ways, I think that what people like Angie are saying, right, is that this sector has, you know, rely on bodily and emotional harm actually as part of their business model, of their production process, right? And then, you know, the bodily impacts and the emotional impacts of work are further compounded by the fact that a lot of these workers are really, you know, employment, migratory, and welfare policies really restrict or flat out denied any access to support and really, you know, restrict their labor mobility, turning a lot of these women in kind of like the paradigmatic form of disposable labor in the 21st century, right? And what I found is that this disposability is really built into, and I was thinking about Uchita's work, it's by design. It's built into the labor process, into the forms of control, into the forms of organizing production, even into the infrastructure of the plants, really, right? And it continues outside of the plants when social institutions really are unable to support the workers. Not only institutions that are, you know, meant to provide aid, but institutions that are supposed to regulate and enforce workplace regulations, that are supposed to ensure that workers have a voice and a right to representation within the workplace. And I'll explain why that is particularly important, right? So here, you know, there's another quote by Violeta, another of the worker. Oh, did I? There we go. Another of the workers, and what she's highlighting here, and I think is really important, and it's usually overlooked in discussions of health and safety in the workplace, is the emotional dimension that this has, right? That this precarious, very precarious and degraded work has. And in some ways, you know, what I found is this emotions are really woven into the organizational fabric of the workplace and really shape practices of supervision and decision making, right? And, you know, in some ways, of course, it's really terrible to have a, you know, low wage, kind of dangerous job, but doing that job while you're also feeling really afraid, while you are really anxious and while you're in pain, it's a completely different reality, right? And, you know, in the testimonials that I gathered, right, like workers kept bringing up this kind of unrecognized and more cumulative damage that they face, right? Because another issue that we have when we're thinking about health and safety in the workplace is this really event-based, right? A lot focuses on acute moments, acute events. But actually, a lot of the damage is cumulative and happens over time, and it becomes normalized and invisible, right? And this appear again, like not only all over, the narratives that workers were bringing up in my research, but when you look at the complaints that they have filed with different agencies, right? A lot of what they're saying was emotional. You could see, like, you know, I don't have it in this presentation, but I have a lot of pictures of the complaints in which they're literally speaking about emotions, you know, and sending that to OSHA, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Agency that really doesn't deal with that in any way, right? Again, I think that, you know, the pandemic, Hello? Hello? Okay, so, you know, I think that the pandemic, you know, as a health crisis, made us think that bodily experiences are a really important place from when to start thinking about workplace precarity. And in some ways, I think it led me to think about it in these three ways, right? How workers, these migrant women's workers' bodies don't really matter in the sense that they are their well-being is completely disregarded in the labor process, but there's specific marks, you know, they racialize these workers that really matter because they mark them, you know, as available for that disposability and for that maiming. And then the actions that workers themselves take to make their bodies matter again in terms of being, you know, subjects of rights, of being, you know, deserving of care, of protection, right? So these are the three ways in which I thought about this. And of course, I think the pandemic and its aftermath also created conditions for workers to really, speak up and really start developing new strategies to resist and to try to change their working conditions. But what I found that it was specifically really important and really interesting is that workers were building communities for survival in some ways, communities of resistance, communities of care. They were not only, they were not only striking for better wages and maybe, better working conditions, but they were doing vaccination clinics. They were creating spaces of grieving, for collectively grieving all the losses that they were suffering as a community. They were bringing their kids, right, to the picket lines to have conversations about their labor rights, right? And in that way, they remind us that when we're thinking of how health and safety, it doesn't really stop at the gates of the factory, right? And it should and it must extend to the community, right? Sorry. And in this way, kind of remind me some of the ways in which some organizers in Spain, they talk about cuidadanía, right? It's kind of hard to translate. So instead of citizenship, it's like caringship or something like that, right? So building communities not based on belonging, the belonging is not based on citizenship, but the belonging is based on mutual care. So yeah, so just to wrap it up so I don't take more time, I know we're running out of time, but I think, I didn't move this time. Yeah, so, I kind of want to connect some of the ways in which the experience of these migrant women really show us ways of improving working conditions in general for this industry and even in a broader way for dangerous, dirty and degraded jobs, the triple D jobs, in a broader way, right? So I think that there's three things to keep in mind from these women's experiences. One, that workers' voice in the workplace is central to health and safety. And this means really moving to incorporate right to representation, right? And to ensure the workers are able to organize collectively and gain that representation in the workplace as central to health and safety, right? Because the workers really do know how to keep each other safe. They really know what changes need to be made in the production lines for that to work for them, right? The second part has to do with this emotional dimension that I keep highlighting, right? And that is certainly overlooked in a lot of discussions of occupational health. Like, how do we incorporate this emotional dimension when we're thinking about health and safety in the workplace, right? And third, as I was saying, right, this idea that when we're thinking about how to improve conditions for workers, for very precarious workers, we need to be thinking about the connections between the factory and the community, and how this, this community building and this creation of spaces for mutual care and mutual aid is really, really central to really improving workers, not only the immediate working conditions, but really to think about a sustainable food supply chain in the United States and beyond, right? But yeah, well, that's kind of what I have to share. Of course, I didn't share anything about the methods or anything behind it because I wanted to share some thoughts, but happy to talk about that.
Thank you for supporting the 4W initiative. The 4W Fall Forum and Social is a change-making platform to bring people together on pressing issues around gender and well-being, and also cultivate leadership and community among scholars and students. The event commemorates the 175th anniversary of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as it highlights past and current scholarships related to gender and well-being. Connecting the vibrant history with the present, we will feature early career UW faculty to share their work with the audience through a half-day forum that includes flash talks, interactive sessions, and a networking reception.